Mafia boss wants her heart for saving her. It was 2:47 a.m. when the hospital doors burst open and the sound of screeching tires shook Rachel out of her exhaustion. She stood in her blue scrubs, small-framed, hair pulled tight into a bun, trying to keep her eyes open after a long shift. But the moment the SUVs stopped outside, her tiredness vanished. Men rushed in carrying a woman who looked like she didn't belong anywhere except an emergency room. Valentina's white silk blouse was soaked in deep red, her designer jacket hanging off one shoulder. Her eyes, sharp, cold, refusing to show fear, locked onto Rachel as she was set on the gurney. A bullet wound near her ribs poured out more blood than her body could afford to lose. People froze. Everyone knew who Valentina was. A leader no one wanted to cross. But Rachel didn't think twice. She pushed through the panic, grabbed the gurney, and shouted for supplies. The woman bleeding out on my gurney was supposed to be my enemy, a crime boss, a killer, someone I should fear. But all I saw was a human heart trying to beat one more time. I had no idea that saving her life would mean she'd spend the rest of hers trying to claim mine. What would you do if saving someone's life meant they would never let you go? Tell us where you're watching from, hit subscribe for tomorrow's story, and thank you for supporting powerful stories like this. The operating room felt colder than usual, or maybe that was just Rachel's nerves catching up with her. Valentina lay on the table, her once white blouse cut open and pushed aside, her skin pale under the harsh lights. The wound near her ribs kept bleeding faster than the suction could clear it. Dr. Kumar stood across from Rachel, giving quick instructions as the anesthesiologist adjusted the settings. Every movement had to count. Every second mattered. Rachel focused on keeping Valentina's vitals stable. Her hands moved automatically, guided by years of training, yet her mind stayed alert. She didn't know why this woman, this feared figure she had only heard about in whispers, had ended up in her care. What she did know was that life didn't care about reputations. Life cared about timing. And right now, time was slipping away from Valentina far too fast. Dr. Kumar asked for a clamp. Rachel handed it over without hesitation. The room felt thick with tension, but she knew better than to let it distract her. Valentina's breathing wavered. The heart monitor warned of a shift. Rachel checked the lines again, adjusting the 4 fluids and resetting the monitors. Her voice stayed steady even when her chest tightened. "Pressure dropping," the anesthesiologist said. "I see it," Rachel replied. Dr. Kumar worked to stop the internal bleeding, but the wound was deeper than expected. The bullet had torn through muscle and grazed an artery. If they lost control for even a moment, Valentina would slip away. The clock on the wall read 3:52 a.m. They were running out of the golden hour, the window when survival was still possible. Rachel pushed a cart closer, adjusting the oxygen. She talked to Valentina softly, not expecting a response but knowing voices sometimes anchored people fighting to stay alive. "Stay with us. You're not done yet. Keep going." Minutes passed. More blood loss. More urgent movements around the table. At 4:05 a.m., they had a small victory. Dr. Kumar located the source of the bleeding and clamped it. But the relief lasted seconds. The heart monitor shrieked. Valentina's numbers dropped hard and fast. "It's crashing," the anesthesiologist warned. That single moment felt like a cliff edge. Rachel reacted before Dr. Kumar could speak. "Bolus now. Increase fluids. Check the airway." She darted around the table, double-checking tubes, making sure nothing shifted. She dropped to the monitor again, her fingers flying over the controls. Something wasn't right. The numbers didn't match the way the monitor was responding. At 4:15 a.m., she caught it. The blood pressure cuff had slipped out of position from all the movement. It was giving false readings, showing higher numbers than Valentina actually had. Rachel fixed it instantly, and the real reading flashed on the screen. Severe drop. Dangerous. She's crashing for real, Rachel said sharply. We're losing her. Dr. Kumar didn't miss a beat. Push another unit. Now. Rachel grabbed the blood bag herself, spiked it, and lifted it high to speed the flow. The anesthesiologist adjusted the ventilator, while Dr. Kumar made a final quick stitch to stop the internal bleed. The entire team fell into a tight, synchronized rhythm, every breath, every action aimed at keeping Valentina alive. Seconds dragged. Alarms continued. Rachel kept her hand on Valentina's shoulder, grounding herself, grounding her patient. Come on, she murmured. Fight. Another minute passed. Then another. The monitor finally steadied. The lines evened out. The alarms quieted. Rachel exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. By 4:37 a.m., Valentina was no longer in the red zone. Not safe yet, but alive. The moment Dr. Kumar said, "We've got her," a wave of relief swept through the room. The tension loosened. The worst had passed. Rachel stepped back, her gloves stained, her arms stiff, her neck aching. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to keep moving, helping transfer Valentina to the recovery bed. The surgery team cleaned up while nurses documented every detail. When Valentina was finally wheeled out to the ICU, Rachel followed the bed until she reached the hallway doors. That was where she stopped. Her legs shook, and her hands trembled so badly she had to grip the railing to steady herself. She didn't cry, though. She just stood there, breathing through the aftermath of adrenaline leaving her body. A large man approached, one of the bodyguards who'd rushed in earlier. He wore a suit that didn't hide the tension in his shoulders. His phone rang, and he turned slightly away as he answered it. Rachel wouldn't have cared, except she heard what he said. The nurse. She's the one who saved her. He paused. Yes, I'm sure. He glanced at Rachel briefly, nodding once, almost as if acknowledging a debt. Before she could ask anything, he walked away to join the others waiting outside the ICU. Rachel stared at the door that had just closed behind Valentina. The quiet of the hallway felt heavy. Too heavy. She tried to shake it off and return to the break room. Her shift wasn't over. There were still charts to complete and other patients to check on. But something inside her felt different, like a small shift she couldn't name. She told herself everything would go back to normal once the sun came up. But normal was no longer waiting for her. By the time she clocked out at 7 a.m. and stepped into the cool early morning air, she didn't know that her life had already been marked. Not by fear. Not by danger. But by the attention of a woman whose world was powerful enough to alter the direction of Rachel's own. A world that had now noticed her. A world that wasn't going to let her fade back into routine. Not after what she'd done. For the first 2 days after the surgery, Rachel expected nothing unusual. She worked her shifts, drank her bitter hospital coffee, and tried to forget the tension in the hallway the night Valentina was brought in. She told herself the bodyguards wouldn't remember her face. People like that lived in a different world, one where nurses blended into the background. On the third morning, she walked into the staff lounge and froze. A large vase of white orchids sat on the table. Real ones. Fresh, immaculate, and expensive enough that she hesitated to breathe near them. A small card leaned against the vase. Thank you for staying with me when the world tried to take me away. V. Rachel stared at it, her co-workers whispering behind her. That's not from a regular patient, one nurse muttered. She saved someone important, another said. Rachel didn't reply. She simply picked up the orchids, walked straight to the reception desk, and handed them back. Please donate these to any patient who needs cheering up, she said. The receptionist blinked. Rachel, these probably cost. I know. But I can't accept them. She walked off before anyone could argue. The next day, another delivery came. This time it was an envelope with her name on it. She opened it, and nearly dropped it. Money. More than she made in a month. She took it straight to hospital administration. I'm not keeping this, she said firmly. The administrator took one look and nodded. We'll document it and return it. Rachel exhaled in relief. But the gifts didn't stop. 3 days later, she walked to the parking lot after her shift and found a brand new Mercedes parked beside her old Honda. A red bow was tied to the mirror. The keys rested on her windshield under a small note. For the woman who gave someone like me another sunrise. V. Rachel didn't touch the keys. She called the hospital security office and asked them to find someone to remove the car. Her voice was polite but tight. She didn't want trouble. She didn't want attention. She certainly didn't want debt. By the end of the week, more gifts arrived. A box of luxury chocolates. A bottle of wine so rare the price made her dizzy when she looked it up. A dinner invitation to a restaurant she had only seen on food shows. Rachel refused everything. It wasn't pride. It was discomfort. Gratitude shouldn't feel like pressure, and kindness shouldn't come with weight. The final attempt came in the form of a handwritten letter slipped under her apartment door. If gifts bother you, then allow me one request. Meet me for dinner. No pressure. No expectations. Just conversation. Valentina. Rachel stood in her tiny living room, letter trembling between her fingers. She read it twice, then a third time. Something about the tone felt different. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't demanding. It was almost human. She still hesitated. But curiosity had been quietly growing inside her since that night in the ER. Not curiosity about Valentina's reputation or money. Curiosity about the woman she had seen fighting to stay alive. So Rachel agreed. The meeting was set at Lotus of Siam on East Sahara Avenue, a place famous for its northern Thai dishes and often fully booked months ahead. When Rachel walked in, she half expected a security swarm or a table surrounded by silent men in suits. Instead, she found Valentina sitting alone. She looked healthier, though still recovering. Her blouse covered the bandaged area near her ribs, and her movements were slower, like she hadn't regained full strength. The restaurant lighting softened her sharp features, and her dark eyes lifted when Rachel approached. "You came," Valentina said quietly. "You asked," Rachel replied. A faint smile touched Valentina's lips. "Sit, please." The waiter brought water, and the quiet between them settled comfortably instead of awkwardly. Rachel noticed something she hadn't expected. Valentina seemed nervous. Her fingers tapped lightly against her glass, her posture was straight but tense, and her eyes were observant without the cold edge they carried in public stories. "Thank you for seeing me," Valentina began. "I know the gifts were too much. I didn't realize how uncomfortable they'd make you. I only wanted to show gratitude." "Keeping someone alive doesn't mean they owe me anything," Rachel said. "I was doing my job." "You did more than a job." Valentina's gaze held her steadily. "I felt you talking to me when everything was fading. I don't know if you remember, but you told me to keep fighting." Rachel flushed slightly. "Sometimes people hear more than we think. I didn't want you to feel alone." Valentina's expression softened. "I haven't heard words like that since I was young." Rachel leaned back slightly. "Where did you grow up?" "North Beach. San Francisco." Valentina paused, almost surprised she answered so easily. "My family ran things there, long before Las Vegas. I studied art history at Berkeley." Her eyes shifted, thoughtful. before life pushed me into the path I'm in now. Rachel hadn't expected that. Art history? That's different from the world you're in now. It was the only time in my life that felt like mine, Valentina admitted. The honesty in her tone disarmed Rachel. It wasn't dramatic or forced. It was simple, direct, human. Valentina looked at her. What about you? Rachel took a breath. I grew up in a small town in New Mexico. My brother had a heart condition. I spent a lot of time in hospitals with him, watching nurses care for him. That's what made me want this career. Is he okay now? He's stable. But there were years when I wasn't sure he'd make it. Valentina nodded slowly. That explains your instinct. You didn't run from danger that night. You ran toward me. It wasn't bravery, Rachel said. I just act fast when someone needs help. I'm grateful you did. They shared their meals, slowly, not rushed, while the conversation shifted from childhood to books, favorite foods, quiet hobbies neither had told many people about. For two people from worlds with no overlap, they found connection in small details. Music they liked, places they wanted to visit someday, the comfort of routine, the weight of responsibility. By the time dessert arrived, the tension between them felt different. Less guarded. More curious. What began as a simple meeting turned into something deeper, something neither of them had planned for. As Rachel left the restaurant that night, she realized the truth. This was no longer about gratitude. Something else was forming, quiet, slow, but impossible to ignore. She didn't know where it would lead. Neither did Valentina. But both felt the shift. Rachel didn't expect to see Valentina again so soon. After their dinner at Lotus of Siam, she assumed there would be space, days, maybe weeks, before their paths crossed again. But the universe had other plans. Or, more accurately, Valentina did. On a quiet Thursday morning, Rachel walked into her favorite coffee shop on East Fremont Street. It was the kind of place where baristas remembered names and steamed milk filled the air. She ordered her usual and turned to wait, only to spot Valentina sitting by the window, wearing a soft sweater instead of her usual sleek jackets. A book lay open in her hands, untouched. "You're here early," Rachel said cautiously. Valentina lifted her head, almost too casually. "Coincidence?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Valentina's lips curved slightly. "Fine. I asked someone where you like to get your coffee." Rachel didn't know whether to be amused or concerned, but something in Valentina's eyes, hopeful, uncertain, softened her response. "You could have just texted. I wasn't sure you'd meet me again." That honesty hit deeper than Rachel expected. She sat down. That morning turned into a 2-hour conversation about everything from music to why Valentina disliked her own birthday. Rachel laughed more than she had in weeks. Valentina looked lighter than Rachel had ever seen her. The meeting ended with Valentina saying, "Can I see you again?" and Rachel surprising herself by saying, "Yes." Their next outing was a walk through Red Rock Canyon. Rachel thought Valentina would bring bodyguards, or a car that drew attention, but she arrived alone in a simple SUV. She wore hiking boots that still had tags tucked inside. "You bought these today?" Rachel teased. "I wasn't prepared for rocks," Valentina said, shrugging as they started the trail. The canyon opened around them with red sandstone towering overhead. Desert wildflowers pushed through cracks in the earth, delicate but stubborn. Rachel showed Valentina how the rocks changed color in different light, how the wind carried the scent of dust and sage. Valentina listened closely, as though every detail mattered. At one point, she touched a sandstone wall and whispered, "Nothing in my life is this old or peaceful." Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them carried something warm. Their walks became a routine. Some mornings, it was coffee. Other days, Valentina would send a short message. "Can you get away for an hour?" Sometimes Rachel said yes. Sometimes no. Valentina never pushed. She simply kept appearing, at the Arts District during mural festivals, at a Vietnamese restaurant where the owner hugged Rachel and asked who a very serious friend was, at the Valley of Fire where ancient petroglyphs sat carved into stone. Valentina treated each place like treasure. She asked questions, took her time, and seemed almost overwhelmed by how normal life felt. One Sunday, Rachel invited her to the local farmer's market. She didn't expect Valentina to show up. But she did, without guards, without expensive clothes, without the heavy aura her reputation usually carried. She tried samples from stalls, bought honey she didn't need, and let an elderly woman convince her to purchase a cactus she would probably forget to water. "This is strange," Valentina said as they moved through the crowd. "In a bad way?" Rachel asked. No. Valentina scanned the vendors. "It's strange because I can breathe here." Rachel bumped her shoulder lightly. "Breathing is good." Valentina smiled. Another afternoon, Rachel took her to an animal shelter where she volunteered once a month. Watching Valentina crouch on the floor to let a traumatized dog sniff her hand was a moment Rachel stored quietly in her memory. Valentina had patience with the animals that surprised everyone. She whispered to each one, offering gentle touches, as though she understood what it meant to be guarded. Later, they ended up at Rachel's apartment for a small game night with two co-workers. Valentina insisted she didn't know how to play anything and then proceeded to win half the rounds. Her laughter filled the room, rich and unrestrained. Rachel found herself watching her more than the cards. Each day, the distance between their worlds shrank in ways neither could explain. The connection forming between them wasn't loud or rushed. It grew quietly, like water soaking into dry earth. One evening, they drove to the Spring Mountains. The sun dropped slowly behind the peaks, painting the sky in soft tones that felt almost unreal. They sat on the hood of Valentina's SUV, legs stretched out, not talking at first. Valentina's voice broke the silence. "Do you ever feel like your whole life was decided before you grew old enough to understand it?" Rachel turned to her. "Sometimes." "I feel trapped," Valentina admitted. "People think I chose the life I live. They don't see how much of it was already set for me before I could speak up. Expectations, loyalty, fear, they shape you until you forget who you were supposed to become." Rachel studied her face, strong, tired, vulnerable in a way she never allowed others to see. "You think fate put you there?" "That's what it feels like." Rachel shook her head gently. "Maybe fate isn't a trap. Maybe it's a direction, and we get to choose how we travel it." Valentina looked at her with an expression that held something unspoken. Something deep. Something Rachel wasn't ready to name but felt in the space between them. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine. Valentina shifted closer, not touching, but near enough that Rachel felt the warmth of her body. "Rachel," she said softly, "you make me feel like I could choose something different." Rachel's breath caught, not out of fear but out of recognition of what was forming between them, slow, steady, undeniable. The sun slipped fully behind the mountains, leaving a soft afterglow. Their shoulders brushed. Neither pulled away. The truth hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Feelings were shifting, growing, changing shape. But the past has long arms, and it never lets go quietly. Trouble showed itself slowly, like a shadow stretching longer across the ground as the day moved. It began with a phone call Rachel wasn't meant to hear, Valentina speaking in a clipped tone outside her SUV after one of their hikes. "No, I don't care if his blood. He doesn't get to make a move on me and expect silence." Rachel didn't ask questions then. But the tension in Valentina's jaw stayed with her long after they drove home. 2 days later, Rachel noticed a black sedan trailing her car on her way to work. It kept its distance but never changed lanes. When she turned into the hospital parking lot, it lingered for a few seconds before driving off. She brushed it off as coincidence. But when she saw a different car following her again later that week, she felt the shift. Her world, once simple, once steady, was changing. Valentina grew more guarded. Her messages were shorter. Her visits became irregular. She showed up with 2 bodyguards instead of none. She scanned every room before she sat down. When Rachel asked if she was okay, Valentina only said, "Everything is fine." But her eyes said the opposite. One night, at the end of Rachel's shift, a man in a dark jacket lingered near the entrance. He pretended to be smoking, but his gaze fixed on her. Rachel walked faster, clutching her bag. Before she reached her car, Valentina appeared from the shadows, stepping between Rachel and the man. "Go home," Valentina said quietly, keeping her gaze on him. "Now." Rachel didn't argue. She drove off with hands shaking on the wheel. Later, Valentina texted, "You're safe. Don't worry." But Rachel did worry. Avoiding her wasn't going to help either, so when Rachel learned Valentina would be attending a downtown gallery opening, she went. It was bold, maybe reckless, but she needed answers. She found Valentina outside the gallery, speaking with 2 of her men. Her posture was stiff, her expression hard. When she saw Rachel, surprise flashed across her face, followed by something like frustration. "You shouldn't be here," Valentina said, stepping aside from the crowd. "I'm not hiding," Rachel replied. "You need to," Valentina insisted. "The person who tried to end my life wasn't a random enemy. It was my own uncle. He's making a move for control, and he won't stop just because he failed the first time. He watches everyone close to me." Rachel felt her breath catch. "You think he's targeting me?" "I think he will if he hasn't already." Valentina drew in a tense breath. "He's testing my weaknesses. So I'm a weakness now." Valentina flinched. Rachel stepped closer. "You don't get to decide what risks I'm willing to take. You don't get to decide what I feel or where I stand." Valentina closed her eyes briefly. "Rachel, I care about you more than is wise. More than is safe." The words hit harder than any threat. Rachel swallowed. "When you showed up in that emergency room, I didn't know who you were. But I ran toward you, not away. I felt alive doing it. I still feel alive when I'm around you. That has to mean something." Valentina looked away, jaw tight. "You don't understand the cost." "Then help me understand," Rachel said. "Don't push me out because you're scared." Valentina's voice dropped, low and raw. "I'm trying to protect you." "Maybe protection isn't the same as distance," Rachel whispered. Something in Valentina broke then, not visibly, but deep in her expression. She reached for Rachel's hand, but stopped halfway, as if touching her would make everything worse. "Come with me," Valentina said finally. "There's something I need to show you." They drove in silence to Ferraro's Italian restaurant, one of the only places Valentina claimed she could still relax. They were seated in a corner booth, away from the other diners. The warm lighting softened the tension, but didn't erase it. Valentina didn't touch her food. "There's no safe path for me to stay here," she said softly. "So I'm leaving Las Vegas. I have a plan. A clean exit. A way to cut my uncle off and disappear long enough to rebuild control." Rachel stared at her. "What does that have to do with me?" Valentina didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her coat and placed an envelope on the table. "This is for you." Rachel frowned and slid it open. Inside were documents, an apartment lease in Chicago, a job offer from a medical center, travel arrangements, even a relocation stipend. Everything was arranged. Everything was real. Rachel's chest tightened. You expect me to leave my life behind because you're scared something might happen to me. I expect you to live, Valentina said. If you stay near me, he will use you to get to me. Chicago is safer. It gives you a new start. You made decisions for me. Rachel's voice wavered with anger and hurt. Without asking what I wanted. If I asked, Valentina said slowly, you would have said no. Of course I would have said no, Rachel hissed. Because leaving isn't the answer. Running doesn't solve anything. It solves you being in danger. It separates me from you. Valentina pressed her hands to the table, trying to stay steady. I don't get to have what I want. Not in my position. Rachel felt her heartbeat thudding. What is it you want? Valentina didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence said everything. Rachel pushed the envelope back. I want to stand beside you, not be shipped away like cargo. Valentina opened her mouth to respond. A sharp noise outside cut through the restaurant's quiet. A sound too sudden, too loud to ignore. The diners froze. Valentina's head snapped toward the window. Her bodyguards at the next table stood immediately. Rachel felt a jolt run through her, sharp as electricity. It was the sound they had been fearing. The sound that meant the storm hadn't passed. It had arrived. Gunfire cracked through the night, sharp and sudden, freezing every breath inside the private room at Ferraro's. The plates on the table rattled from the vibration, and Rachel felt her pulse jump as the bodyguards moved in front of her and Valentina. They didn't wait for instructions. Their arms were already raised, their stance firm, forming a wall between the women and the shattered calm outside. One of the guards pressed a finger to his earpiece. Stay low, he said without looking back. His voice was steady, practiced, but the tension in the room was sharp enough to feel in the chest. More shots rang out. Tires screeched. A man shouted. Someone else yelled for backup. Rachel grabbed Valentina's wrist without thinking, pulling her closer. For a second, all Rachel saw were the same flashes of panic from that night in the emergency room. Blood, alarms, noise, a woman fighting to stay alive. But Valentina wasn't panicking now. Her jaw was tight, her posture controlled, yet her grip around Rachel's hand was fierce. A guard rushed inside. It's not an attack. It's law enforcement. Rachel's head snapped toward him. Law enforcement. He nodded once. The street is full of agents. They're arresting your uncle. He directed this last part to Valentina. For the first time, Valentina's expression faltered. What? The guard continued, quicker now, as voices outside rose in sharp commands. The FBI. They've been running a long investigation. Your uncle walked into a trap. Rachel's breath caught, but Valentina looked like she'd been hit with something harder than any bullet. For months, she had been fighting shadows, cars trailing her, threats passed through back channels, the constant fear that someone would strike at her again. She had expected war. She had prepared for it. She had tried to push Rachel away because of it. But this was an ending she didn't understand yet. Another guard stepped in. His men are done. They surrendered. They didn't expect this. Rachel slowly let out the breath she'd been holding. The gunfire had stopped. Outside, the noise shifted, doors slamming, radios crackling, agents giving orders. No more running engines. No more shots. No more uncertainty about who might come out of the dark next. The investigation, the guard went on, has been building for years. The attack on you was the final mistake they needed. They had enough evidence to bring everything down at once. Valentina sank into the nearest chair, her hand covering her mouth. Rachel stayed beside her, unsure whether to speak or hold her or give her space. The room felt too quiet now, too still, as if everything that had once held weight, power, threats, territories, had evaporated in a matter of minutes. The untouched pasta on the table had gone cold. Rachel finally broke the silence. "So, it's over." Valentina didn't answer immediately. She stared at the table, the doorway, the floor, everywhere but Rachel. When she did speak, her voice sounded unfamiliar, like she was still trying to understand it herself. "It's over for him." Rachel knelt in front of her and gently took her hands. "What does this mean for you?" Valentina blinked, as though coming back to herself. "I don't know." Rachel stayed still, waiting. The guard stood outside the doorway now, giving space but staying alert. The hum of law enforcement activity outside grew quieter as vehicles drove away, leaving the echo of a city settling back into its usual rhythm. After a long moment, Rachel asked softly, "So what do you want now?" "Not what's strategic. Not what keeps others calm. Not what looks strong. What do you actually want?" Valentina looked at her as if no one had asked her that in years. Maybe no one had asked her ever. On the table lay the envelope she'd slid to Rachel earlier. Chicago job offer, apartment keys, an entirely different life she tried to force Rachel into for her own safety. Rachel picked it up and handed it back to her. Valentina stared at it for several seconds. Then she pushed it away. "Chicago isn't the answer," she said quietly. "Sending you away, pretending distance could keep you safe. I don't want that." "So what do you want?" Rachel asked again, firmer this time. Valentina took a slow breath. "I want to figure out who I am now that this weight is gone. I want to find out who I can be, not who I was told to be." Rachel smiled gently. "Then let's choose that. Together." Valentina's eyes softened, the wall she carried for so long finally starting to lower. "Together," she whispered back. Rachel stood and extended her hand. "Not Chicago. Not running. Something new. Right here." Valentina hesitated only a moment before taking her hand, gripping it with a steadiness that felt like a vow. It wasn't the fierce grip she used in danger. It was the grip of someone choosing a future instead of surviving a past. Outside, Ferraro slowly regained its usual quiet. Inside the private room, 2 plates sat untouched, steam gone, a reminder of the night that started in fear but refused to end in it. The war had ended with badges instead of bullets. The threat that once controlled Valentina's life was no longer in the shadows waiting to strike. The city had shifted, but so had she. And now, with the dust finally settling, the choice of what came next belonged to them, fully, freely, without the weight of a fight they never asked for. Rachel squeezed her hand one more time. "We'll figure it out." Valentina nodded. "The months ahead won't be simple." Rachel smiled knowingly. Simple wasn't what brought us here. They walked out of the room together, past the guards, past the cold plates, past the doorway that had framed the end of one life and the start of something else entirely. The months that followed were not easy. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a world Valentina didn't recognize, a world where the threats she once expected at every corner had gone quiet. The power her uncle held evaporated overnight, leaving empty seats at tables that once shaped entire neighborhoods. Yet instead of stepping into that space, Valentina stepped back. She refused leadership. She refused titles. She refused to become the next name people whispered about. Instead, she accepted an advisory role, temporary, distant, focused only on helping transition responsibilities to lawful hands and keeping violence from sparking again. Her voice was respected, but she stayed behind the curtains, offering guidance only when absolutely necessary. It was the first time in her life she wasn't at the center of anything. And oddly, it freed her. Rachel noticed the change long before Valentina admitted it aloud. She saw it in the quiet mornings when Valentina stood at the window not to watch for danger but simply to feel the sunlight. She saw it in the small moments, when Valentina paused at street art murals, when her fingers drifted across gallery brochures, when she moved slower through spaces she once treated like battlegrounds. One afternoon in the arts district, while wandering through converted warehouses and colorful walls, Valentina stopped in front of a studio space with high ceilings and dusty light drifting in through old windows. Her gaze lingered, thoughtful. Rachel nudged her gently. "What's going on in that mind of yours?" Valentina didn't speak for a long time. Her eyes were on the blank walls, but her voice was soft. "I spent my life protecting things that never belonged to me. I never made anything. Never created anything. I used to love art. I studied it because it felt like freedom. Then I gave it up because it wasn't useful in my world." Rachel watched her, sensing something delicate forming. "You could take it back," she murmured. Valentina looked at her, a quiet ache in her expression. "Could I?" "You already are." It didn't happen fast. It didn't happen easily. But slowly, Valentina began rediscovering the pieces she'd buried. She rented that empty studio. She renovated it with patience she didn't know she had. She met local artists, sculptors, painters, photographers, and instead of being treated with fear, she was treated with curiosity. They asked about her past, but not the part tied to the shadows. They wanted to know why she loved Caravaggio, why she favored deep reds, why she could spend 20 minutes describing a single brushstroke. 8 months later, the gallery opened. It wasn't grand or flashy. It was honest. White walls, soft lighting, and art from people whose names weren't famous but whose stories mattered. At the opening night, Rachel stood beside her, watching her interact with visitors, listening to her describe each piece with pride and gentleness. It was the first time Rachel saw her carry joy without fear attached to it. But transformation wasn't built on one night. It grew through the ordinary, steady rhythm Rachel slowly introduced her to. Rachel took her to charity events where children clung to her hands without flinching. Health fairs where she helped carry boxes of supplies and laughed when volunteers teased her about her designer shoes in the dust. Sunday brunches where her shoulders relaxed, and she allowed herself to enjoy the simple comfort of shared food and easy conversation. The first time they visited the Grand Canyon South Rim together, Valentina didn't speak for nearly 10 minutes. She stood at the railing, eyes wide, breath shaking. The layers of color stretched into the horizon, deep oranges, soft purples, shadows shifting with the sun. It was vast, untouched, completely outside the world that once consumed her. Rachel stepped beside her. "Are you okay?" Valentina wiped her cheek quickly, embarrassed. "I didn't know the world could be this open." Rachel slipped her arm around her waist. "It's been waiting for you." Months later, when Rachel brought her home to New Mexico, the welcome was slow but sincere. Her mother greeted Valentina with polite caution, the kind reserved for someone whose past carried weight, but she watched closely, observing how Valentina opened doors, how she took in every photo on the walls, how she spoke to Rachel's brother with gentleness instead of intimidation. By the end of the visit, Rachel's brother, who rarely gave compliments, said quietly, "She's good for you." Rachel saw Valentina blink fast, moved more than she expected to be. But healing wasn't a straight line. Nights came when she woke trembling, breath sharp, heart racing at sounds that weren't threats anymore. Rachel held her through each one, whispering the same words every time. "I've got you. You're safe." Valentina clung to those words like a lifeline. 3 months into this new life, everything shifted again. Valentina's father, already weakened by years of strain, passed away peacefully in his sleep. Rachel sat beside him in those final hours, holding his hand when Valentina couldn't bring herself to watch the last breaths. He whispered to Rachel in Italian, voice faint but clear, "Make my daughter happy." Rachel didn't tell Valentina that night. She waited until after the funeral, when the grief softened enough to make room for truth. When she finally shared his words, Valentina broke, silent tears, shaking hands, head lowered against Rachel's shoulder. "He trusted you," she whispered. "And I trust you," Rachel answered. That moment became a turning point. The fear that had always kept Valentina half-armored began to ease. Not overnight, but slowly, steadily, like thawing ice. A year after the night outside Ferraro's, Valentina walked down the street toward her gallery, coffee in hand, sunlight on her face, no guards trailing behind her. She paused at the door, looking at the space that once felt impossible. Rachel walked up beside her, brushing their fingers together. "You ready for today?" Rachel asked. Valentina smiled, small, genuine, grounded. "I'm ready for everything now." The grand opening of the Rossitores Community Health Initiative drew a crowd that stretched down the sidewalk, a blend of families, volunteers, local leaders, and neighborhood kids chasing each other between folding chairs. The building wasn't flashy, clean lines, warm colors, open rooms filled with light, but the energy buzzing through it felt alive. It was more than a clinic. It was a message. Not redemption. Not apology. A beginning. A statement of intent. Rachel stood on the small stage, adjusting the microphone as Valentina watched from the side, hands clasped behind her back. Rachel spoke about healthcare access, about community trust, about the hope of building something lasting. When she introduced Valentina as co-founder, there was a brief hush, a mix of surprise and uncertainty from those who knew pieces of her past. But when Valentina stepped up and simply said, "This place exists because every life deserves a chance to move forward," the crowd softened. Applause followed. Not thunderous, not cautious, steady, real. That night, long after the last guest left and the lights were dimmed, Rachel found Valentina standing in the lobby, fingertips brushing the clinic's mission statement on the wall. "You built this," Rachel murmured. "We built it," Valentina corrected, but her eyes shone with something she rarely let herself feel: pride. Life after that settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both had grown to love. They moved into a quiet house in Summerlin, close enough to the Red Rock Canyon cliffs that sunsets painted the sky orange and rose every evening. The house had a small garden where Rachel planted herbs and vegetables, and a studio out back where Valentina stored canvases, sculptures, and bits of inspiration she collected during their trips around the city. Their Sunday mornings became sacred. Before the sun even rose, they drove out to the Valley of Fire, hiking trails while the air was still cool and the world felt untouched. Sometimes they talked the whole way. Sometimes they walked in silence, comforted by the crunch of sand under their boots and the growing light stretching across ancient stone. During one of those dawn hikes, Rachel watched Valentina pause at the top of a ridge, the desert stretching far and wide around them. She asked quietly, "Do you ever miss it?" Valentina didn't pretend to misunderstand. The question hung in the soft air. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not the danger. Not the control. It's more like a phantom limb. A part of me shaped by years of expectation. You don't turn that off. You learn to live around it." Rachel nodded, waiting. "But I don't want to go back," Valentina added. "Not for 1 second." Rachel stepped closer. "Why?" Valentina looked out across the red rock landscape, her voice steady. "Because building something good requires more courage than maintaining something feared. And for the first time in my life, I want courage more than power." Rachel felt warmth rise in her chest, deep and quiet. She reached for Valentina's hand, and Valentina squeezed back with the same certainty she carried in her voice. Their life wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. They learned each other's rhythms like a language. Rachel's habit of leaving tea mugs around the house, Valentina's tendency to reorganize books by color at 2 in the morning, the way Rachel hummed when she cooked, the way Valentina slipped into Italian when she felt overwhelmed or deeply relaxed. They argued sometimes, about work, about fear, about small things that didn't matter and big things that did. But each disagreement ended the same way, with honesty, with a gentle hand at the back of the other's neck, with the understanding that neither was going anywhere. 2 years passed quietly, filled with growth. The clinic expanded to mobile units. The gallery hosted its first statewide art competition for students. Their home gathered memories, dinners on the patio, late-night conversations in bed, shared glances that spoke louder than words. One warm evening, Rachel sat in the garden with her medical journals spread across the table. Valentina sat beside her, sketching thumbnails for her gallery's next exhibit. Fireflies shimmered faintly around the plants Rachel had tended with patient care. It felt peaceful. Almost too peaceful for two people who had survived the kind of night that changed everything. Rachel looked up from her notes, her gaze lingering on Valentina's profile. Calm, focused, hair tucked behind one ear. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. Valentina didn't look up from her sketch. "Of course." Rachel hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of her journal. "That night outside Ferroro's. Is there anything you wish you'd said? Before the gunfire?" Valentina froze. Her pencil paused midline. Her shoulders stilled. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting Rachel's with an expression Rachel couldn't quite read. Part reflection, part ache, part something deeper. The desert breeze shifted, warm against their skin. The soft hum of distant traffic blended with the quiet sound of her sketchbook closing. The question lingered between them, heavier than the moment before, pulling something forward neither had spoken about in full. Valentina inhaled, preparing to answer. The conversation they'd both avoided for years was finally ready to rise to the surface. Valentina closed her sketchbook and set it gently on the table. Her eyes stayed on Rachel for a long moment, thoughtful, steady, almost searching. "There's something I've replayed in my mind more times than I can count," she began softly. "Why did you run toward me that night? Everyone else stepped back. You stepped forward. You didn't even hesitate." Rachel exhaled, her fingers brushing over the worn cover of her journal. She had known this question would come someday. It lived in the quiet spaces between them, in the memories neither of them wanted to disturb for years. "I ran because I saw someone fighting," she said. "You had this look in your eyes, like you were angry at death itself, like you refused to give up. That kind of strength doesn't belong on a cold hospital floor. I wasn't thinking about who you were. I just saw a person trying to hold on." Valentina swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved more than my life that night. You saved who I could become." Rachel shook her head gently, but Valentina reached out and took her hand before she could deflect the compliment. "No," Valentina said firmly. "Listen to me. Since that night, you've seen every version of me. The gallery owner who still second-guesses her ideas. The woman trying to learn patience at charity meetings. The person fumbling through community planning sessions. The absolute disaster in the kitchen who somehow burns pancakes every single Sunday." Rachel laughed, unable to hold it back. "You do. Every single Sunday." Valentina smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "And every time I fell short, you didn't pull away. You didn't flinch. You acted like I was worth staying for. You gave me a reason to try, again and again." Rachel squeezed her hand. "You did the work. You walked into every hard moment. You made those choices. I was just there beside you." That's the point, Valentina whispered. You stayed beside me. Even when I couldn't see what a future might look like. For a moment, neither spoke. The garden around them swayed gently in the warm desert wind. The distant glow of Las Vegas stretched across the horizon, soft, steady, almost tender from where they sat today. Valentina leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting upward. You know, I used to think strength came from walls. From keeping everything locked tight. From never letting anyone close enough to hit where it hurts. She turned her gaze to Rachel again. But the truth is, your openness wore me down in the best way. You didn't push. You didn't demand. You just cared. And caring is something I never learned to accept until you. Rachel studied her for a long moment. Healing doesn't always come through medicine, she said quietly. Sometimes it's hearts learning to trust again. Sometimes it's people discovering they can be more than survival. Valentina's smile held a mix of warmth and disbelief. You talk like you didn't change too. Rachel lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. I learned that running toward danger isn't always reckless. Sometimes it leads you to someone who changes your entire world. The words settled between them, heavier than the warm night air. Valentina reached across the small table again, tracing her thumb gently along Rachel's knuckles. That bullet, the one I took that night, she said quietly. It broke through more than my skin. It cracked open everything I hid behind. I hate the memory of it, but I can't deny what came because of it. Rachel's throat tightened. We saved each other, she said. Not dramatically. Not in some life-changing moment. But slowly. Daily. Through choices. Through showing up. Valentina nodded. Through trust. The garden lights flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the plants they tended together. In the distance, the city sparkled like a reminder of all the chaos they'd survived, and all the peace they'd chosen instead. Rachel rested her chin on her hand, watching the woman across from her. If someone told me years ago that running down a hallway toward a stranger would lead me to this, I wouldn't have believed them. Valentina exhaled a quiet laugh. If someone told me a bullet would end the life I knew and open the door to a life I actually wanted, I would have said they were out of their mind. But here we are, Rachel whispered. Here we are, Valentina echoed. Their future wasn't perfect. It wasn't mapped out. It wasn't tied to power or fear or survival. It was built day by day, choice by choice, heart by heart. They had learned that love didn't need grand gestures. It lived in small things. Valentina wiping flour off Rachel's cheek during one of her rare cooking attempts, Rachel leaving handwritten notes in Valentina's studio, shared grocery trips, quiet nights on the couch, hands brushing when neither wanted to be the one to pull away first. In a city built on luck, where fortunes rose and collapsed overnight, they found something better than chance, a bond built with intention. Valentina tilted her head. Do you think we'll ever figure out exactly how we got here? Rachel smiled. I don't think we need to. We just keep choosing it. Valentina reached across the table, palm up. Rachel placed her hand in it without hesitation. Their lives were no longer shaped by fear, or fate, or survival. They were shaped by the steady courage to lean toward each other instead of away. Their future stretched open, unwritten, uncertain, but theirs to build. As the wind rustled through the garden, Rachel whispered, the greatest gift wasn't saving a life in crisis. Valentina nodded softly. It was building one together. To everyone watching this story, thank you for spending time with us. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Your support helps bring powerful stories like this to life.